Give folks a chance to enter. Hello, everyone. Ah, there we are. I see new faces and so good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us again. I see a few names that tells me that there are a few folks that have attended all of these sessions, which I find very impressive. So, my name is Betty Ann Bryce, and as you know, we've been holding a series of what I like to call discussions around the rural principles and different aspects of the principles. And this is a particularly interesting topic for us today because it's not our usual topic. We always talk about rural-urban connections, but we rarely delve into the agricultural connection. So I'm very excited today to have a number of different speakers that can address this issue. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules. First, this meeting will be recorded. And as normal, we will share a link to the recording and we will share the presentations after. Second, we will always do our best to provide opportunities for questions. I think we should be able to do it today. I take your critiques that we have not given as much time to Q&A as possible. My hope is that we can accomplish that today. In the event, either way, I would like you to always put your questions in the chat, please. Put the name of the speaker and your questions in the chat, and our speakers will engage with you there. I've asked them to pay attention to the chat and to respond to questions as they come in. If it's a question for all, say all. If it's for a particular person, just put their name. With that in mind, I think I will just go straight to introducing our colleagues. As I said, we have a distinguished panel today. You'll see them on the screen, but I wanted to point out two things. We have obviously a trade and agricultural directorate, so we are privileged to have one of our colleagues from our agricultural directorate on who will be presenting today, as well as our colleague from our city division. So we are doing our best to do our own rural-urban connections and also bring in our colleagues, our expertise from within the OECD. So with that in mind, I wanted to introduce David Bergalesi, who is an economist with the City Division. And I thought it was a good opportunity for them to start out with how they are thinking about rural urban and maybe painting a wider picture of this kind of agricultural potential connections that they could be thinking about from their perspective as they do the urban work. And of course, I have to say there are natural enemies. I say this, I should say frenemies, because we're always trying to find ways to bridge that gap between rural and urban. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Betty-Ann. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening to everybody in the stage. So my presentation, yes, thank you. So I'm David, I'm an economist and I particularly do research in the field of urban systems. So I also touch a lot of rural linkages. So first of all, next slide, please. I would like to give you an outline of what I will touch in my speech today. First of all, I would like to stress the fact that urban and rural areas are not so separated, and not at all. Actually, they are part of a special continuum, and there are some factors that I like. I liked a lot of interrelationship between urban and rural, like proximity to city, that is a factor of development for rural areas. A second point to touch is the role of agriculture that characterize urban area too. It is a key part of those urban-rural interdependencies. And then I would like to jump into the policy part with the OECD principle of urban policies and how they are or they are not implemented across OECD countries to pick for some good practices on leveraging these potential urban leakages, and in particular touching the sphere of the circular economy lens, just to end with some lessons and directions that we can learn. So next slide, please. So as I told you, I would like to start my presentation probably in three main figures that already can show what is the relevance of urban-rural relationship. The first figure is about the fact that even for a urban point of view, we assume, we strongly believe that we should go beyond the full dichotomy between urban and rural, because actually they are part of a special continuum, and this imposes us to go beyond the sectoral approach, instead to embrace a territorial approach, integrated and systemic. What you see, for instance, here on this map on the right side is a case that that I pick from a study we carried out in Poland a couple of years ago. We did made a review, a national review on urban-rural linkages, which was a joint work between the urban and rural part of the of the OECD, and we found, for instance, in this part that if we take a functional approach to cities, which is mainly mainly taken by using the concept of functional urban areas, as we do in our work, which is basically the combination between cities and their commuting zone. We see, for instance, in the map, you see for this is the city of Wrocław that show the functional urban area, what is the boundaries marked in red. You clearly see that inside this functional urban area, if we remove the core cities, most of the municipalities are actually rural areas. And in general, I can give you that in the functional urban areas of Poland, for instance, we found that in excluding the core cities, so in the commuting zone, more than 80% of the surface, the area is rural, villages or low density areas, and almost still the population lives in there. So within functional urban area, there is a lot of rural, and this highlights how commuting already shapes urban-rural connection. And commuting, I would like to come back to this at the end. Next slide, please. Uh, this is another figure from a recent study that we carried on. It is about an analysis that we carried out earlier this year on EU countries. When we analyze European settlements of all sides, and what we found, if we go more on the rural settlements, so villages, so settlements below 50,000 population, we found that clearly those settlements show a dynamic of the population. Half of the villages in the European Union are lost population in the last decade. However, what we also find, you find on the graph on the right, that those villages that are close to the cities or better connected to the cities, in particular to large cities, grew in population even more than the cities themselves. As you can see. This is an evidence of another source of interdependencies, more dynamic, as we see, where settlements near cities, rural settlements, provide the residents with access to some opportunities, employment, services, etc., in the cities. And actually, we found that those settlements do not offer a full range of services, but they can, I mean, people residing there in those rural areas clearly borrow from the cities, and vice versa, so there can be some directional analysis. This is a point to be considered, for instance, in going further, because an increasing number of towns and villages across the OECD are projected to experience population decline and aging. This calls for reinforcing those linkages. A third figure that I would like to show in the next slide, please. It's so the agriculture. on the lens of or under urban lens, we clearly say that if we take a functional approach, agriculture do characterize urban areas, or more precisely, the urban-rural continuums in several ways. To take the two cities, I mean, two ways. On the left, Paris. You see in the map, the red is the built-up area. In Paris, as in other cities around, a huge movement of urban farming. Big debate on how to use the space, and there is some potential to use some urban space for farming to make the city more, not only more sustainable, but also to drain some also some economic resources. On the right, another city completely different, Rome. That within the city boundaries, you clearly say a few kilometers away from the city center of Rome, you have agricultural landscape. And of course, this ends with the farmer market in the cities. And let me just stop a bit on the farmer markets, because to me, to us, in both cases, or under an urban perspective, a key point is that, okay, beyond clearly that agriculture provide urban markets with agricultural goods, of course, but going beyond this, some initiatives that are linked to territorial urban-rural connection, like local production markets, also stimulate city development, city vibrancy, well-being in cities, and provide economic opportunities. And this again is a particularly relevant. Those examples are large cities, but this is particularly relevant in cities in a context of demographic change, where strengthening those urban-rural relations can be a way to mitigate the demographic transition, to adapt, in particular small cities, where local food markets can act really as anchors for social and economic development of communities. Of course, agriculture, next slide please, is a key part of a wider set of interdependencies, urban-rural, that OECD Bettian knows very well, as have analyzed and recognized. Agriculture is the primary source of value and the foundation of economic chain that links cities to rural area with a wider set of relationships that you can see clearly from the graph, and a strong part of urban territorial development. A takeaway from this, if can be, yes, for sure, if taken under a systemic, and I would say a value chain perspective, where cities do clearly have a part and a big role to play, not only on the demand side, but on the supply side of agriculture and food production. And this turns me to the policies, and to the next slide, please. Actually, urban policy recognizes the role, the key role, and the potential. Strengthening urban-rural connection is a core policy pillar for both urban-rural policy. In this series of webinars, we are discussing the principle of rural policies. We have some twin principle of urban policies. And one of them is clearly dedicated to urban-rural linkages, say that aiming to strengthen the potential by leveraging the spatial continuity and functional relation between urban and the rural, and by carrying out joint strategies. So there is a strong place for this to target an effective scale of policy action. But, next slide, please. Earlier this year, we conducted a global analysis of national urban policies worldwide, and we found that despite the relevance, it appears that the potential of rural linkage is relatively untapped. Findings from the report that we recently launched found that less than half of the national urban policy really going to foresee concrete action to maximize this potential. And if we go to OECD countries, we found only, I mean, this principle 3, or urban policy principle, it clearly appears only in 35% of national urban policy. So these calls really suggest a need for national urban policy to recognize this, and to recognize that national urban policy should also go beyond the city boundaries, and there is a need for sectoral coordination between urban and rural policies to make those policies effective tools, not only for urban development, but really for territorial and regional development. Next slide, please. How to bridge this gap? We found that despite this, some countries had advanced. Actually, 2 years ago, we conducted an analysis on the implementation of the principle based on the inputs the country have, like the policy framework, their processes, the existence of a policy, and the performance. And we found that some countries are actually advancing and providing insight. Take about Poland, that whose national urban policies focuses a lot on strengthening and embracing urban-rural linkages, but Poland also has a lot of subnational policies based on this, and also tackling the like conflict of use of the land between urban and urban, and avoiding urban sprawl, etc. Romania is another case, similarly, and also Switzerland linked with the development of policies for mountain. On the next slide. So there are some lessons and some cases that provide insight. A point that we like to highlight is how to turn urban-rural potential, and in particular agricultural food production, into action. So back to agriculture, we also found within our work stream of circular economies in cities and regions that many cities are actually advancing, recognizes the need to integrate circular and territorial food system to connect urban rural areas. I mean, and this is not only for sustainability, but also to boost economic opportunities, job and well-being in cities and within their functional urban areas. So we have some interesting cases like Guelph in Canada, mid-sized cities that it's as a program, a strong program for this, as well as large cities like Toronto, Brussels, or Lisbon, or Kyushu in Japan that adopts really a circular approach also to recycle what is produced at the end of the food process, etc. The lesson is that circular approach can be an actual tool for cities and for regions to foster those relationships. And so, if you can pass to the next slide, please. I would like to conclude that with some key lessons that we learned from all those our work streams, and this can be a base to reflect together urban and rural with the ways forward, and possibly to introduce also the agricultural perspective. The first lesson is the need to invest in data, in the evidence, and in particular, I would say on multidimensional metrics. From an urban point of view, I mean, of course, there are, but also from the rural, the data limitation to compare urban-rural linkages across countries, across cities really can be a really problem. Beyond what we have on commuting and population patterns of some economic evidence, so we still have a lot of gaps to bridge in terms of granular knowledge of urban-rural linkages under several domains: economic, social, environmental, etc. To bridge this, another key lessons and the way forward, I would say there is the way for countries and for cities is to adopt an approach which should be territorial, meaning functional, so considering the continuum, not separating those boundaries. Circular, of course, because circular definition is local and implies a strong connection and win-win between the urban and the rural. And what I would say, a value chain approach to boost those bidirectional relationship between the rural part and all the services provided by the urban part, the knowledge creation, and really to see agriculture as a co-production process between urban and rural areas. From more for a policy point of view, ways forward is clearly, and this is the evidence come from our work on national urban policy, the need to mainstream urban-rural linkages into national, subnational policy frameworks to connect, for instance, sectoral ministries to break silos, more activity in the national urban policy. So urban-rural linkages, we clearly see there is a need for them to be an integral part of national, regional, and local development process. Of course, this need sharing goals, strategies, financial incentives, a strong set of instruments. But there are some cases, for instance, in Colombia is another case of national urban policies grounded a lot of urban-rural linkages. So we have cases in the Netherlands. So happy to hear later on about this, about developing energy collaboration between urban and rural areas, for instance, that can generate a mutual benefit. A fourth key lesson is to promote by promoting this territorial approach to foster to promote intermunicipal collaboration, like for instance create a supra local development strategy. Of course, a big barrier that we found is the capacity, especially in smaller municipalities. So it needs to be, this is an aspect that needs to be bridged, and to actively implement this approach. What is necessary is to build trust through partnership by means of inclusive and flexible partnership. Start with small-scale project, learn from this, and then replicate in other contexts. And finally, a point which is at the basis is about the connectivity and infrastructure between urban and rural. As we say, they are an unicum, they are a continuum, but in many cases, these need to be reinforced. The digital connectivity is an issue, even within functional areas between cities and surrounding rural areas, and physical connectivity. And so here the key word is to promote territorial development between functional areas, which is dense and connect. And dense, again, I would say it's a way also to solve potential conflict between different uses of the land. Now there is, of course, there's a big issue of housing. For instance, they need to provide housing, but of course, conflicts with agricultural land use in cities, the city boundary in peri-urban areas. So this is a point to be taken into account. So those were the main points I would like to point out. With this, within the next slide, is just to thank you for your attention, and I'm available for any question you may need.
David,
Thank you.
thank you so much for opening with that kind of overview. There are probably going to be a number of questions. I want to have the two OECD folks go first, and then we'll take questions. But in the meantime, do put your questions in the chat. The chat is open, so just put their names and the questions in there. This is the most, I have to give David credit because he's from the urban unit, so I gave him a lot of work to think about rural. And so, David, you did very well. Our next presenter is also within the OECD. It's Jesus Anton, who is the head of unit in trade and agriculture in the Trade and Agricultural Directorate, so outside of my space, our space. And I'm happy to have Jesus here to provide his perspective, as he is, we're on the rural and city side, he's on the agricultural side. So, Jesus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Betty-Ann. And it is also challenging for me going out from my area of agriculture, going into rural and urban policies is not my expertise. And I will try to focus on my presentation mainly from the perspective of agricultural policies, and also the role of rural and urban in the new agricultural policy narrative. That will be my main starting point. Next, please. And I don't want to show a dichotomy view compared to the continuous perspective that David presented. I don't think that's my idea. But since I'm talking about narratives, it's important about the image that we have about what is urban and what is rural. And I think what we have in terms of urban is a good idea of abundant population, rural, abundant land, and abundant nature. That's what we have in our minds. Next, please. In our outline, what I want is to focus on first what are the agricultural the policy perspective in these urban and rural agricultural connections. And starting from this idea of the narratives, I will just try to present what is the current narrative and the past narrative that has completely dominated agricultural policies in the past. And then I will move toward thinking about what is the new narrative that is being built in around different the approach of food systems, but also thinking about social sustainability and the convergence of different policies, as David was presenting in his presentation. And I will finish with some concluding remarks. Keeping in mind that agricultural policies very often don't include some of the agriculture that is in peri-urban areas, just to make you know that this divide also affects sometimes even the design of the policy. Next, please. I think these numbers confirm a little bit the image in the photographs. That the idea, and here again, the divide we know is not is not so black and white, but here gives you an idea how the population, the urban population, represents across OECD countries. Those are very broad averages and should not be taken as that, but about 4 times as much as the rural. Meanwhile, they live in a fifth of the total area. And next, please. Meanwhile, agriculture is not a location, so it's not a place, and it can be both in urban and rural. It is dominantly in rural areas, but it still represents only about 1% of the total employment, and maybe a third of the total area. That depends very much across countries. I'm not trying to make any average here meaningful, but of course it's much more present in rural areas, and despite that, it doesn't represent a big share of the employment in rural areas, and it does indeed represent a big share of the area in rural areas. Next, please. So the agricultural links between urban and rural were very well presented in the small context paragraph that were presented for this conference. I don't need to go through the details of them, just reminding that, of course, there is the flow of goods that go from agricultural goods that go from mainly rural, but not only, as we have said, to urban, and that includes good quality, both staples and high quality food, but also other goods. There is labor that secularly has been flowing from agriculture to other sectors, and it makes it very difficult for policymakers making agriculture attractive for the young. There has been agricultural innovation very often is generated in urban places, but it is applied at the end and adopted in rural areas, and we are always pledging for making more and more agricultural innovation a co-creation with the farmers, with linkages, of course, with other industries and other places. And of course, there is demand for traditions and culture that are more predominantly in agriculture, and they are linked to in rural areas and linked to agriculture, and which is demanded by many urban citizens, and of course the demand for environmental services and preserving the nature that very often comes very strongly from urban areas, but in which agriculture in rural areas mainly plays a major role in terms of landscape, soil or water or biodiversity. Next, please. The policy perspective, I want to first think that agricultural policies are normally designed in the centers of the political power normally are in urban areas. And these policies reflect the preferences and the concerns and the priorities of the different population, urban and rural. But very often these policies have been in the past reflecting some simple narratives about agriculture and in the whole society and the whole economy that not match very well with the factual evidence. And I would like to talk a little bit in my presentation about some of these simplified narratives in terms of the what is being called the farm income problem, and a bit on the agricultural income footprint of and then trying to move forward into the new narratives that are being developing and that are trying to move the sector into an inclusive transitions towards sustainable food systems. The narrative is very important because in the past they have had an enormous effect in terms of the policy design and also about the inertia of the policy. Next, please. So the first item in the current narrative is what it has been called normally the farm problem, the idea that there is an agricultural sector which is lagged and is shrinking and compared to other sectors. And then the idea is that there is a need of, because agriculture is very important for food production and it's a residual sector, normally with low productivity and particularly low agricultural productivity, low labor productivity, that needs support to farmers and through, in the past, a bit more through high prices, more recently through direct payments. When you look a bit at the facts, the OECD averages of income farm household is often not significantly lower than the other households. Recent evidence has been shown that in some countries is very similar or it's even above what it happens with households that are not agricultural households. And this has discussed just last week in the OECD Farm Level Analysis Network meeting that we were having here in Paris. The context, of course, is that there has been a significant reduction in the gap between rural and urban areas. And this reduction in the gap creates new opportunities as well for those who work in agriculture in rural areas. And sometimes this even has been reverted, the gap between urban and rural in some countries. Next, please. Second element of this narrative is the fact that there is an important negative agricultural environmental footprint, which is related to the large use of land that agriculture has in the global surface and the important significant use of water, that is about 70% of the whole freshwater use. And of course, that has implications in terms of the importance of agriculture in deforestation on tropical and subtropical areas, or as well in the impact of agriculture to the reduction of habitats and putting species in danger and therefore affecting biodiversity. And it has also in terms of the importance of agriculture on water pollution or the contribution of agriculture to climate change as well. This picture shows a lot of concerns that are coming from very often from urban areas and urban citizens, not only very often don't reflect also the positive externalities that are associated also to agriculture, which are related to landscape, to ecosystem services. But this is another topic I will not tackle in this presentation. Next slide, please. So these narratives really have shaped the agricultural policies in the past. And we observe we have moved in the past, the first reform that agricultural policies in OECD countries has taken was moving from high prices to high payments, that were allowing to have more impact on the income of the farmers, improving their revenue. That was the main priority from the first until the 2000. From 2000 onwards, there has been a little bit of change in the narrative, including these environmental outcomes as an important part of the role of agriculture in the whole economy, and has been introducing significant elements in terms of regulations, conditionality, and in terms of how the agricultural policies are being implemented. And this has also been sometimes generated some discontent among farmers, including some recent demonstrations that we have seen. So that's the first two steps on the recent reforms and pathway of the agricultural policies. The next step is moving about these social and societal issues, concerns, and a more broader food system approach to the agricultural policies. This is more for the future than for the present, but is, as we know, very important, because we know that this is going to be, this narrative that is built around that will probably affect significantly the shape of future agricultural policies. Next, please. This new narrative, of course, a big component of it is the complexity in the urban-rural relationships through the food systems, and particularly through the value chain. And we know the value chain is complex, from the inputs of production, processing, retailing, and consumption in the household. That's known from the past. It's not new. What is a bit more new, next please, is the fact that there is not only the production that goes through these elements and the supply and demand signals that go through this value chain, but the fact that there is an additional feedback that comes from the final consumer. Very often, a big share of the consumers are in urban areas, and this feedback comes in terms of what are the impacts in production, in livelihoods, in environment, in waste and losses, in nutrition, and in health, and which are not fully transmitted through the value chains. These new topics are in the intersection, affecting both urban and rural areas, and we have a strong agricultural connection. This is the case, for instance, of issues related with nutrition or overweight, what can be produced and how we're going to consume it, what are the linkages that it has in terms of the environmental impacts and emissions, and even going beyond that, because whatever is not is consumed and is not produced will have trade impacts. What are the connections in terms of the environmental and the impacts that will happen in other countries? Next slide, please. The second big important component of this new narrative is this movement beyond the sustainability in terms of economic sustainability and environmental sustainability towards a social sustainability of the agricultural sector, which is an important demand in the discussion of these new food systems. And here we find, of course, a difficulty that is not only specific of agriculture, is beyond that, the definition of what is social sustainability. It is difficult to have a clear agreement among different governments, different persons, different people about what is exactly this sustainability, which in any case, of course, implies issues related with decent jobs, inclusiveness, gender, but that going into these issues is a significant change in terms of agricultural policies that traditionally have been focused more on the production side. There are important data gaps. Some are specific of agriculture, and is the fact that for social, in many of the surveys, the sector-specific information is small. The samples are very small and not representative compared to what happens with economy-wide data, and that's a specific problem when we try to social issues in agriculture. When we go there are also other issues which are more broader across different sectors and for the whole economy, and the fact that surveys very often have difficulties in capture some of these social issues because of different sensitivities. Think, for instance, about mental health or other issues that are affecting significantly agriculture. And finally, funding indicators, and that's also a difficulty that affects both all the economy, but indicators of measuring what are the social impacts and also the drivers and the causality about these impacts. These have to be also benchmarked. We have to understand compared to other rural areas and compare to urban areas as well. So covering these data gaps will help, with no doubt, to having a better knowledge about the well-being of farm households compared to rural households and compared to urban households, and therefore having better understanding of what is the social sustainability and inclusiveness in the sector. Next slide, please. The third element I want to highlight is very much related with what David presented. There is a convergence between the agricultural policies, rural policies, and even urban policies in the idea. And we have worked in the past with our colleagues in rural on these convergences of policies, the dialogue on policies that include, where inclusive transition towards sustainable food systems, the idea that sometimes very often place-based approaches and focus on well-being are the appropriate ways to tackle these issues. issues. And that requires polycentric governance, inclusive co-development of the policies, and probably going not only to urban policies, but also, as it has been mentioned before, through urban policies. Next one, please. Those are my last two slides. The first one, this is trying to define the main challenges that are in terms of the agriculture that is mainly, as we have said, rural, but not only, and food systems. When we try to do this kind of food systems approach, is more in the intersection between urban and rural, and that makes a change of paradigm in terms of the narrative that we have to try to find a way to respond. Then the idea that agricultural policies, as they are now, they are ill-designed for most of the to respond to the main new food system challenges. There is a need to target better any income issue that are it's in agricultural sector, and a need to target as well to resource-based environmental programs that are able to deliver on environmental outcomes. And there is a big question on how we can incorporate the social sustainability into the agricultural policy narrative, which is not yet the case. Then we have seen that with this new approach, is less about their supply and very often about how the demand issues are coming back to the production side of the process, and this creates very often a different views on some of these issues from different perspectives, and these concerns are very often dominated by urban, and there is the risk of creating some kind of urban rural conflict related to these agricultural issues and demands to agricultural issues. The new relationships are also not simple. Very often they're double directional, and it is not easy to find one fits all policy, as is very often in many agricultural policy approaches. And we need to find really be innovative in which we are going to find and define the new policies, finding ways in which we have a diversity of channels of distribution, of communication, of labels, regulations, and other policy and private solutions that have to be combined in partnership together. And finally, I want to make a big point in terms of that in this new narrative that we're trying, that this being built, we cannot have farmers just as passive beneficiaries or victims of the system. It have to be in the new narrative that for the policy that we are able to empower the farmers to become active drivers of the food systems transformation towards more environmental and sustainable food systems. This will create, and this requires thinking about how we can create opportunities to increase the value added that is created by the farming sector, and also diversify the connections that they have to the different parts of the economy, both rural and urban. And this we cannot take this engagement of farmers as given, and it is needed in order to create this new narrative and define new policies. Next slide, please. And this is going to be the last one. Final challenge is the fact that a lot of these demand issues, we know in the past that a lot of the policies had difficulties in terms of different interests from different groups, but a lot of these demand issues are related not only to interests, but also to values, and values which are related with culture, with different views about how societal views about how what are the preferences, and this makes it more difficult, and there is the risk that there is an urban-rural divide in some of these values issues that are related to agricultural and the food systems. And we have to be, I'm thinking about issues related with environment, nutrition, and cultural, and these risks have to be very much taken into account. The fact that we need more data and more sources of data, that may be an opportunity, because the reality is that now we have much more data available, and also technologies that allows us to gather data from different sources and also trace data in terms of the tracing, for instance, the environmental sustainability along the value chain. And finally, the idea that these new interlinkages between urban and rural, in which agriculture is an important driver, it's very likely to, is asking us to break silos, and this breaking of silos is really a big opportunity in order to improve the inclusiveness and sustainable and social sustainability of the whole food systems, and to create a new narrative in which farmers have to be active drivers of the change. And I think this is very important to be able to have the change, and I think we are not there yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus. That was a very comprehensive overview. I have my own questions. I promised I would open it up at this point, but now the margin of questions I can take have diminished to 2. So please put your hands up if you have a question, burning question for our OECD colleagues before I open up the speakers to outside OECD. So seeing no hands, we will keep going. I want to go on the record as saying I did open it up for questions. Now, I appreciate that. Let's turn now to going outside the OECD to get some perspectives from different countries. Here I want to say thank you to the Netherlands government because they've been working with us on a number of these seminars. And this one in particular, we have Niek Hazendonk, who is Senior Policy Officer at the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, Food, Security, and Nature. So that's a mouthful. Please, the floor is yours to share with us and give us kind of bring the Netherlands perspective on this issue into the discussion. Do you want to share your slides? I think you're on mute. Nope, you are still on mute. Okay, there you go. Nick, I don't know if you're talking, but we cannot hear you. Okay.
I
Now
tried to share the thing I shared before, but
No.
and I'm totally.
Did you want to we have your PDF. Did you want us to share it?
Okay, you can do that.
Okay, so maybe you stop sharing. Elena, could you share his PDF?
Oh,
Okay, floor is yours.
so okay. Thank you for inviting me just some days ago. So I had to make very quickly a presentation in a serial I wasn't involved before, but still okay. Here I will say something about agriculture in urban-rural relations in the Netherlands. So I work for the Strategy, Knowledge and Innovation Department inside the ministry. And as you said, it's a mouthful. So it reaches from agriculture over fisheries to also food and nature. Go on. Yes, so the Netherlands, compared to other European countries at least, maybe not to other metropolises, is a special case because as you see, this is an example. We are a very urbanized country. So that brings in, I think, some special issues that are not everywhere an issue as it is in the Netherlands, maybe in Singapore or in some other metropolises. But so we are in that thing, a special case, I think. You see here some pastures with not the density of cows that is normal, but at least you can remember that the density of grazing in the Netherlands is very high. Pass on. Next slide. So going into these aspects, the Netherlands are very urbanized, and we don't have any of what you could call deep rurality. We are not Romania, and there is also not such a campagne as in, for instance, France or other countries. So you could say, on one hand, we have cities, and on the other hand, the countryside, although it will be contested, is also totally urbanized. What happened was in the 20th century, also due to the work of OECD and FAO and our own government, even Mansholt, who was president for the European Union, we had a development of high industrial agriculture. So the old soil-based, locally based agriculture was very speedy at the end of the century, changed into industrial agriculture. So with a very high intensity of farm production, and also combined with that a decline of farmers, of the farmers' population, and also diminishing the direct relation between producers and consumers in every way. The thing that you should notice, as said already, the Dutch in some way are a special case, that we have very high land prices because of urbanization, but also related with that, very high agrarian land prices. That makes that our agriculture is almost forced to intensify. So I put here 2 times Germany's prices, 7 times France prices. I looked it up in the morning, and it's even worse, I think. So that makes special conditions about development of agriculture and also about the relation with the city. In the countryside, which is not, as I said, a campagne, but really an urbanized countryside, you can see due to this decline of farmers that 9 out of 10 rural addresses are citizens, not farmers, are not agrarian related. On the other hand, the farmers or some companies or NGOs, they own the land. So you see many people living in a rural environment while they are not farmers. So that makes also that agriculture in relation to society has a special place. Next slide. So then you have several forms of relations. We heard some before. You have physical relations. There are ecological relations. Think about, apart from all kinds of processes and fluxes, also green-blue infrastructure that should go inside town and make relations possible for plants, animals, but also for people going inside and outside town. There are economic relations between the urban, the rural, and agriculture. There are cultural relations and social relations, and also health relations. I put here apart something that, especially in our case, is becoming very important, the zoonoses, where in our case we are so urbanized and so densely populated and full of intensive agriculture. Zoonosis is becoming more and more something you should think of when you put so many animals as in the Netherlands together with people. Next slide. So this is how it looks like. This is then high density glasshouse horticulture. It's called also the crystal city. So you can imagine, is this city, is this rural, what is this? Go on, next slide. It looks like this on eye level. So this has also, and all these other types of agriculture has relations with industry and with the city by energy delivery, by carbon dioxide input, by the need of workers. So there are all kinds of material fluxes and people fluxes going in and out, which are directly related to the city. And also the glass houses deliver energy and other products back to town, and also residues that can be used in industry and town. Next slide. So this is another example. So you have the plant production in the glass house, but you have also the animal husbandry in high densities. This is a good example where they are trying to do it totally circular. So this is an example where they don't use animal feed from other countries or from own production, but they only use residues of bakery and industry. So I think that's a very good example of circular, and anyway, also they look into animal welfare. Go on. Next slide. So, and it's not that this only that this high intensive agriculture is outside the city, but also it comes inside the city with all kinds of forms of urban agriculture. So green and open, but also again glass houses and less, because that's the problem. I said already zoonoses. This is inside the town of the capital, The Hague, where we had some urban agriculture inside the town. Next slide. And even more and more technologized now, we have vertical farming also inside buildings in the countryside, but also in the city. Next slide. So, and I said also this need for workers. Here you see some protests against migrants. So the question of migrant workers is also a question. Does the rural, if you call it anyway rural, this crystal city, does it have enough place for the migrants workers, enough facilities, and where do they go then? They go or come out of town. Next slide. In the past century, I worked together with colleagues on a vision on city landscapes. And one of the chapters was about urban agriculture. So also because we saw that, as presented before, that the city and the rural is a continuum. And so we tried to break the borders, the frontiers between our pillar and the pillar of physical planning and urban planning with this document. And we touched several aspects, but also urban agriculture. So that's the agriculture that is strongly related with the urban. And we formulated 4 types of urban agriculture: the high technological agriculture, often built up, so glass houses, but also stables with the particular problems. Also the regular soil-based agriculture with the cows and the meadows, etc. And then this same open agriculture, but then biological and all kinds of other formats that you have in this alternative agriculture. And the last one is the hobby, the part-time, or the educational farms, which you see in towns and around towns. And of course, these are also solo 4 extreme typologies. You have all kinds of grays in between. For instance, you see a movement between this 3rd and 4th form, where hobby farms, educational farms become also professional, or people start as a hobby and then enter into serious agriculture, because by owning land and hiring professional farmers, which is a special concept. And always with these types, we looked into what's the extra value for the business, because they are related to town, and other way around, what's the extra value for the city. And so you can name various of those relations. Some I called before about these nutrient fluxes or material fluxes. Also, we talked in this vision about the rule for leisure, for recreation, in and outside, and the relation between those things in the urban rural realm. But that's not the subject now, but it has some relation. Next slide. So, but with all these, what I said before, in the end, some 2-3 years ago, we ended up with this heavy discontent and farmers' rebellions, doing some environmental planning on a national scale. We realized that farmers really got angry and went on the street. Next slide. What is behind this? There is really a big tension and a gap between countryside and the city, or between the farmer and the city, because, as I said, farmer and countryside is not one-on-one, because there are so many citizens in the countryside. We have this high level of urbanization also among the farmers. You could say, okay, these farmers are not the traditional farmers anymore, because they are well educated, they are modern, they have all kinds of things that make them more urban citizens than traditional farmers. But still, there are cultural differences. And there is a heavy debate now going on about debate and attention about a gap on different scales and forms, for instance, between the central towns of Randstad, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, etc., and the rest of the country, or between the cities as such and the country, between the villages and the country. And so, as I said, this became a farmers' rebellion, and out of the rebellion, there rose even a political party, the Boer-Burgerbeweging, the Farmer Citizen Movement, who are now in government. So first in provinces, they gained places and they gained the elections, and now they are also having some seats and ministers in the national government. So about this gap, you can see you can say there is a real gap, and there is also a felt gap, which is maybe not so real. But anyway, if it's felt, it has also its own reality. And one thing behind it is we are not treated well by politicians, by the city, by others. Fill it in. The actual government, whereas I said this farmers citizens movement also is working. They say we have to restore the trust that is broken. Bring the next slide. So there is a lot of regional and local resentment. Why? Because I think agriculture and environmental policies sometimes were too technological orientated, were too bureaucratic. And so you could also say it's not only agricultural environmental policy that has impact on the local living quality, because also mobility, also social, also all kinds of other policy fields make that people in the countryside feel abandoned, feel less that they have less attention, etc. And also economic and market developments as such, more or less autonomic, as you will. So, for instance, they ask bigger scales. They make that hospitals aren't in every village available. All kinds of things are scaled up by this economic efficiency drive. So, several reasons why there is a regional and local resentment. And you could say that it's also emotional and cultural, not being seen by politics, or a felt loss of facilities. Sometimes they lose facilities, but sometimes it's only a felt because also the same upscaling is going on in towns. And important is, even if there is a loss and it's felt, they are not recognized, these losses. So in reality, also, there are really vulnerable groups in the countryside who have lost their jobs or by some reason are left in the countryside and don't have so much possibilities and are hit more by the development as I described before. And also there is bad environment sometimes through agriculture or by other ways. So we should realize that. And new government has programs, and even the agricultural programs now strive more to work at a social economic vital countryside and pay more attention to these regional emotions and cultures. Next slide. So I see these trends and actions going on, where I don't go too deep in government policies, but more in what is going on. So we should give more attention to the social and cultural aspects of developments and policies, both on the urban and the rural side. We should make living quality grow and strive for, you said it in other words before, but for broad, inclusive prosperity instead of only environmental sustainability, also social sustainability, the whole spectrum, and incorporate participation and a design approach into our government programs. You see that citizens themselves become more and more active with agriculture, like movements like Land van ons, which means land of us. So citizens who can afford it, they buy arable land, they buy agricultural land, and then hire or search for farmers that cultivate it in the way as they like it. Or herenboeren, farmers, big farmers, but then in a way that what before were kind of landlords that had enough money and land to hire other people to work the land. In this case, it's that people together buy land, make a collective, and then hire farmers, work themselves on the land, and make agreements about how to cultivate it. All these kinds of movements are going on, still niche-like, but they say something about the relation between citizens and farmers and society and farming. And then still the high-tech building-related agriculture, of course, goes on. And what we are doing out of the government and also from the sector is look for the industrial ecological flows and fluxes between the urban and the agro production. Yeah, looking for circular economy, looking for circular agriculture. So energy, nutrients, inputs, water, all kinds of things. By this more controlled agriculture, you can try to get into grip, and then you see that they are in reality really connected to the urban system, to the logistics of the urban system and industrial system, etc. So instead of just letting it grow in the countryside, just give it a place somewhere where it historically was, you should plan them smart inside the urban system. And then also always with this precaution with zoonoses. With plants, you can act much more easily than with animals, but it's also good to combine plant and animal production. And maybe in the future also you get this artificial ways of producing animal and plant protein, which is also a thing that should fit into the rural and the urban system. Next slide. So this is shortly to stress that we should look into these industrial ecological flows from the city to agriculture and back, and from other sectors also connecting to the primary producers in agriculture. Next slide. So, and then we have these other types of agriculture, of the 4 types I showed before. This is a case where you see citizens, people working on the land as friends of the farmer. Go on. Next slide. So people, they make agreements with farmers that they can harvest, or that they can help to prune and to keep up the old orchards that are not efficient enough for farmers when they have to do the work alone. Go on.
Hey, Nick, just to
So
let you
then we
know,
have this connection with urban markets, with direct selling, etc. Next slide. And also the social part of it. So it's not just working or buying, but also socializing around agricultural sites. Next slide. Yeah, you see these other types of agriculture should be a multifunctional agriculture. We should think in organizing short chains, also because of the advantages for sustainability, etc. So short change means that there's not more than one step between the consumer producer, and that the relation is good traceable, because sometimes you have also this consumer producer relation over a big company, and then it's still not traceable where the products are coming from, and there is not a really deep relation between the two. So one step, but also very deep into this relation.
so
When you
sorry
start
to cut you.
producing, it's the
Just
easiest when there's not much processing needed. So in the moment when you need more processing, this one-step approach and short chain is difficult, but then you could start with lean startups. So searching for producers that can help you to process your products, and before starting your own factory or processing plant. Always it's important then, when you have this type of agriculture, to think in what kind of ecosystems you can deliver, and what is the added value from your farm, the added value to the normal farm products. And the farmer
excuse
needs
me,
to know the
Nick,
consumer. Yes?
I'm so sorry. I was wondering, is it possible to just cut it short? We have 2 more presentations after you.
Yes, I cut it short in a minute. So what happened is during COVID epidemics that these farm shops grew quite a lot, because people like to be connected to other people, and they were afraid to go into the urban environments to buy food. So self-service regional projects, organized collectively and not individual, are important elements. Next slide. So I keep it with this. I think living and environmental quality, this broad inclusive prosperity counts. You should develop visions and perspectives on the future for urban regions, whereby design, landscape planning and design can help. And you should study economic, social, ecological drivers together for this transition of urban landscapes, and bring innovation really directly into practice to learn on the spot. I finish with that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nick, for a very comprehensive overview of what's happening in the Netherlands. I ask you to just put all questions for him in the chat. He covered a number of interesting aspects to this and added to the conversation. I'm going to go right to Bettina Bergman Madsen, who is going to present us with a perspective from Denmark. I'm going to also take this moment to thank the WHO in coordination with the Rockefeller Foundation, because we worked with them to kind of bring 2 new perspectives. Bettina will be sharing one, and Bill Green will follow her with another perspective from kind of a big city working and thinking about the rural hinterland. So Bettina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I also like to thank WHO for connecting us. I found it very interesting so far. So hello, everybody, and thank you for wanting to hear about the case of Copenhagen. I worked as a public food procurement officer in the city of Copenhagen for many years. I started in 2009. In Copenhagen, the politician has very high goals. We have 90% organic, and the politician set this target in 2001, wanting to reach it by 2015 without no extra cost on the plate. So this was the target when I started my journey in 2009. I always start with this picture of a mountaineer looking at the mountain. It could be the political landscape which we have to cross, or the political fulfillments we have to put into life, how to do this. And I think procurement could be one of the tools. Can you see me changing the slides? Yes?
Yes,
Good.
we can. Yes, we can.
So we don't only have our local municipal politics we have to follow. We also have politics such as the National Organic Action Plan. The politicians set an organic plan so that all cities in Denmark should reach for 90% organic. We have our official dietary guidelines, and we have an action plan for plant-based food. All this has to be incorporated into the procurement, into the public meals, and how to do this. Sometimes when you meet procurement officers, we can say, well, I do the procurement, I make sure that the contracts are in place. So we are the bridge builder between the kitchens that are cooking the meals, or the suppliers who are delivering the meals, and the suppliers like the firms who give the bid to the tenders. That is also why we can be the key that actually brings the political goals into life. We can make sure that we move towards a more sustainable direction. So I often see the procurement officer as being the one where we can decide if we stay at the dry land or if we go to the more green side, actually. So, because if you do not incorporate some of all these political goals into your procurement, use the procurement as a tool, then you will do business as usual. Nothing will change. We have to ask for it. We have to measure it. We have to follow up. So some of these things you can actually do by procurement, prove that we are moving in the right direction. We have two kinds of cooking. We have cooking on site with chefs cooking for citizens, often with citizens also. And then we have catering. I actually see no difference in incorporating the political goals. We can do them in both. So sometimes when I give presentation, people are, but it's because you cook mainly on site and you can do this for the goods that you buy, like the milk, the flour, the meat and so on, the greens and vegetables and lentils. No, you can also do it in catering. You can ask the same criteria for the food that we buy in catering. We can also do it for canteens. So that's, like all goes for it. So how do we use this procurement to build the bridge? Because in Copenhagen, we serve approximately 150,000 meals per day, and it runs up to a huge amount of money. We invest in cooking differently because we want the chefs to be able to cook sustainable, delicious meals, because we know that we will reduce food waste, and on the plate, the food waste is reduced. If we like the meals, we eat it, right? If it's disgusting, we throw it away. So we have to make sure that the meals that we serve are delicious. And here comes also the procurement in, because if you ask for the right quality food, then you will also be able to cook delicious meals with it. We have a food strategy, which we have been implemented in 2019. And we are working on it right now, also creating a new food strategy. Here we build the linkage. It says that we have to build the linkage between the urban and rural area, because we are a city, even though we are a small city, but even then we are Denmark's biggest city. So we have to create the linkage to the more urban area. And how to do this? Because can we do this with procurement? I think so, we can. We have to make sure that everybody's treated equally. By saying treated equal, we also have to open up our tenders towards small and medium-sized enterprises, also from the local area. So if we have farmers nearby, why not make sure that we break our contract up to smaller pieces so that they have a possibility to give a direct bid? So to bring policies into life, we can have procurement officers, we can have conversion agents, the one who tells the chefs how to cook differently. We of course have to have market dialogue. I have to talk with the farmers, I have to talk with the suppliers, the wholesalers, the grocers, to make sure that they go along with the crazy ideas I put into my tender material, into the documents that I put in for procurement. And then we have to talk with the kitchens, the ones using the contract, because I cannot put in criteria that makes it impossible to use the contracts. But combining all this, that actually makes it possible to create opportunities into the procurement that we make. These people are the key of cooking the delicious meals, the kitchen staff. Because I can make a great procurement with all different kind of sustainable aspects into it, but if they are not using it, then what's the case? Then we will not implement the sustainable changes that we need. So I need to make sure that they know how to use it and that they actually like it. We incorporated the sustainable goals into our procurement. We have no flight policy. We have taken account into packaging. We have seasonality and diversity, because an apple is not just an apple and pear is not just a pear. We have many different kinds, and we have to make sure we have them into our procurement. Once we have them into our procurement, actually, then we also support small-scale farmers, because small-scale farmers are often the ones living nearby. They have a lot of varieties. So this is one of the tools where we can get many different small-scale farmers working with the wholesalers. We saw in Denmark, once they started delivering different kinds of apples to us, it also hit the supermarkets in our local areas. So it hit the supermarkets in Copenhagen. So now we can buy like a bag of mixed apples from Danish origin, for example. This is actually a fun way, and it was just because we asked for it through our procurement, and they thought, okay, now we get it from so many different kinds of farmers, because we said you will get points on how many different kinds of apples you can deliver to us in season wherever they are grown. So this is a tool how you can open up your tenders so that many different kinds of actors can come into play. Another thing is that we looked at the market. We saw that we have some potato farmers on our nearby the city. And they said, hey, we would like to give a direct bid to your tender. I thought, I always thought, why not link the buying of the food with the teaching of the kids? So by making this contract with the farmer, we also asked him to supply like this bucket for the kids and a potato to plant. So the kids, they grow the potato, they harvest the potato, they cook with the potato. This is what we wrote into our tender, where we also buy the potato. So the potatoes that we buy go into the school meals and into the elderly meals and so on, but it also links the kids with the farmer. We linked it with teaching, and we linked it with a visit to the farm. So here they see how hard it is to grow. The teacher went online on YouTube telling, oh, this is how I grow the potato. He digged it up from the bucket so that they could see it growing. Because the kids were not supposed to dig it up, of course, it should be growing down there. But then they saw what is going on. Kids are curious, and they saw like the roots and the small potatoes coming. And then they harvested, and then they saw how hard it is. And when they visited, he talked about the sizes and how hard it is for him to sell all the sizes, that we always go for the medium sized or the very small cute ones. What about the middle ones? We also want them to be sold. So here we linked the kids with the farmer. And actually a fun fact is that these kids are around 13 years old, and they're really cool and preteen. So when they went outside, they didn't want to go to the farm, and they thought, no, why should I use a whole day at a farm? But then when they saw the farmer, they yelled like, oh my God, you're that famous guy from YouTube. Oh my God, you're so cool. Can I take a selfie with you? So they kind of linked with the farmer, and he showed them the farm. And before we knew of it, they digged potatoes up like it was gold, and they were like really excited that they could bring it home. So this is important, that you can also use procurement to do this linkage. In Copenhagen, we don't stop with this. We want to be able to buy the whole chicken, not just chicken breast, chicken legs. We want our wholesaler, the wholesaler supplier, to build the bridge between us and the farmer, so we can be better to predict what we want to buy. We also want to be able to predict what kind of lentils and beans do we want for the next season, and how many, so the farmer can plan the field for it. So this is what is coming up, hopefully, in Copenhagen. I cross my fingers, because this is just a dream I have, but sometimes they come true. Last thing is that we have built this National Food Procurement Officer Network, where we inspire each other. So it's all food procurement officers. We are around 50 officers in this network, where I tell how I did, and they tell me how they did, and we build upon each other's experience. And this We also did in a teaching materials so we can share. This one is how we together can make the world's most sustainable and healthy public food procurement. We wrote actually with WHO in a project called Joint Action Best Remit. So this can be read and shared. And the other ones is also something where how to open up for small and medium-sized enterprises in public procurement, and a legal guide on how to. If you don't know that much about procurement, you can read that. It's all for free download. And we built a European Food Procurement Officer network. So if you know any procurement officer in Europe, we can link to this network and share experience. But we also have a One Planet network, actually, an interest group on sustainable public food procurement. And I encourage everybody who is working professionally and in the public setting with food procurement to join this. And then thank you. That was my 11 minutes now. Sorry, 1 minute past. But yeah, sorry, I stopped sharing.
No worries, Bettina. Thank you so much, and very comprehensive and very interesting. And I encourage you to post questions in the chat and, of course, follow up with Bettina. I'm going to go immediately to Bill Green. Thank you, Bill, for joining us today. Bill is the Executive Director of the Common Market in the United States. I believe you're based in Atlanta, if I'm not correct. And I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation on how you are using this project to support socially disadvantaged farmers. So the floor is yours. Bill, I think you may be on mute.
There we go. Whew. All right. Thank you, Betty Ann. Thank you all for having me today. I've really learned a lot. Bettina, definitely want to come to Copenhagen. Loved your presentation. I think there's a lot we could do together. So a little bit about the Common Market. The Common Market is actually a nonprofit food aggregation and distribution company. And a lot of the conversation I've heard today really speaks to why the Common Market was founded in 2008. As this linkage, as this bridge between rural and urban communities. We were started by Hailey and Tatiana, a married couple living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and they were working in community with groups planting trees, building community gardens, working with youth, and found that many of the citizens they were working with suffered from preventable health-related conditions. And you can flip to the next slide, please. And so they tried to find food for these citizens and went outside of the city to find local food. What they found were small to mid-sized farmers who actually were growing at an appreciable scale, but didn't have access to markets. And that's come up several times today, the importance of markets. And so this nexus, this connective tissue for the Common Market was formed. And so Hailey and Tatiana learned that if they could build this bridge between rural farmers, smaller rural farmers that are not the larger farms that already have contracts with the major retailers, and what we call anchor institutions, public schools, hospitals, universities, community organizations, early care, senior care centers, that the health and wealth of all people would be improved by this nexus. And so if you flip to the next slide. So what Hailey and Tatiana did was they sat down with a number of farmers and listened to what they had to say. And I think that's so important because we're talking about solutions here. And I think it's just important to raise that we have to listen before we attempt to solve. And that's exactly what Hailey and Tatiana did by listening to farmers, listening to community groups about the importance of local food and establishing a logistics network to help that occur. And so one other thing I'd like to mention on the Common Market is that we are not just about local. I represent the Southeast, which is Georgia, Alabama, Texas, South Carolina, and parts of Florida. We define local as 250 miles from our warehouse, which is in Atlanta, very close to our airport, similar for the other regions where we do business. But it is not just about local. It is also about sustainable growth. It is about respect for the land. It is about employment practices. It is about organic, regenerative growth, all that fall under this category of values-based procurement. And so if you go to the next slide, the three roles that we really serve is that we have this network in each of the geographies where we operate of sustainable local family farms, that they're all committed essentially to health, committed to healthy communities, healthy economies, responsible treatment of animals, healthy environments. That is what our farmers represent. We conduct year-round aggregation and distribution and help these farmers find markets. And those markets that we find, we actually are that last mile delivery service that brings that food from farm to institution, and in some cases to the end consumer in schools, community organizations, as I mentioned, and other community-facing organizations. And so that is what the Common Market does. Next slide, please. These are the geographies where we currently operate. We were started in 2008 in Philadelphia, as I mentioned, which is our Mid-Atlantic region. I am the Southeast region. I lead the Southeast region that was started in 2016 and 2018. We started Common Market Texas, based in Houston. And then just this year, we launched Common Market Great Lakes, based in Chicago. So as you can see, it's a replicable model. And we certainly have plans to expand this local values-based procurement model across the country. And to date, we have invested about $250 million in the environment, in the communities where we operate. Next slide, please. So again, we are that bridge between farm and table. And the farmers that you see represented on the left side of this slide are many of whom are farmers who have had contracts in the past with public schools, with major retailers, with other buyers, but because the medium-sized farmer is not ever going to be the lowest cost bidder, many of them were losing their land, did not have an opportunity to support their families. And so the Common Market stepped into that gap and became this bridge for those farmers to be able to sell their food to schools and universities and hospitals, as I mentioned, next slide, please, who have health challenges. Because again, health is at the base of this. The health and wealth of all communities, of both urban and rural, is what we stand for. And so we found that by moving this food and by engaging in projects such as food as medicine projects, which we currently do with Morehouse School of Medicine. And we are actually not just providing food from local farmers to the citizens that are part of this program, but also we are measuring the vitality and the fiscal health of the farmers that are able to participate in this program. And so programs like that are intended to just increase the health of both of those communities. So next slide, please. So why Black farms? In the United States, and particularly in the Southeast, where I am located, Black-owned farmers of color at one time had a very predominant presence in this area. So in 1920, it's estimated that 14% of all farmland in the United States was owned by people of color. By some estimates, that number has fallen to about 0.4%. So as you can see, the farms that are represented in my region primarily, but also in Common Market, Texas, are all right where we are in danger of losing these farms. And so that's why the Common Market came to the Southeast and why we continue to invest here. Next slide. So working with vulnerable populations, vulnerable farmers, like those that I'm referencing, we have become a trusted source of connection to these farmers. So we've been selected for multiple USDA programs, including the LFPA program that we are currently leading, where we are connecting over 30 socially disadvantaged farmers with the 8 food banks in Georgia. We have a similar contract in Texas, and we are looking to expand those contracts in some of the other regions where we operate. But it has been a game changer for those farmers. We also are selected as one of the distributors for the Local Food for Schools program, the LFS program. And so we're working with over 38 producers there and over 25 different school districts. And so these are opportunities to move food at scale. So we're not talking about farmers market production. We're not talking about customer-supported agriculture, agricultural tourism. These are wholesale opportunities in dining facilities facilitated by our partnerships with the big three food service management companies that do most of the food procurement. The last thing I'll call out here is the Forward Commitment Program, which we started in the Southeast, that is starting to spread to the other regions. And actually, some of the larger distributors in our region are starting to pick up the concept, recognizing that many of the farmers that we're talking about are not going to put acres in production if there's not a market for them. And so we've negotiated relationships with many of our buyers to say, okay, if we have this group of farmers that is going to produce this group of products next season. So right now we're negotiating for spring of 2025. How much of it will you buy? And we have a number of buyers who stood behind that. That program started 2 years ago, and it is growing significantly and providing security for farmers. Neek mentioned trust earlier. Many farmers didn't even trust that there would be a market, so they were not growing food. So farmers are now beginning to trust that there's a market for their food, and they're now putting in production. Next slide, please. These are some of the investments that we have been making, and for the interest of time, I'll just call out philanthropy. When we first started this work in the Southeast, many in the philanthropic world said, well, we only invest in urban areas. We don't invest in rural areas. And what they're coming to understand is if there's not a meaningful investment in rural environments with these small to mid-sized farmers, there won't be an urban area. And we will not be able to provide food for our community long term. And so the Rockefeller Foundation has made a wonderful investment in the work that we do. And that investment has encouraged local foundations to also come on board with this work. And so we've been able to support infrastructure purchasing on property, extend loans, zero interest loans to farms, because we recognize that the programs that I mentioned, LFPA, LFS, are not possible if farmers don't have meaningful infrastructure. And so we've been investing in that as well. Next slide. So with the remaining minute that I have, I just wanted to call out one success story around what I've been talking about. The picture to the far left is the Coastal Georgia Small Farmers Co-op, one of those farms that has had a history of disinvestment, as have all the farmers in that region. We began buying from that farm. They have all the infrastructure needed to participate in the wholesale market, but lack the marketplace. So we brought our buyers to them, and we're able to start small, buying only a few cases of product a week, and built trust with them and also built markets for them at the same time. And over 3 years, we've grown their business 515%. Not only has that farm benefited, but the farms in that region who lack that infrastructure utilize the infrastructure that this co-op provides. And now it's simplified the logistics that we can run one truck to that region, pick up from a number of farms, and bring that food back for the urban partners that we have here to feed communities. So I think that's how this could work. And so my lessons learned here that I would share, one is the importance of advocacy, and everyone on this call obviously understands that, but also the importance of implementation. Implementation in terms of investment, intentional investment, but also in partnership, because none of the things that I've talked about can be done in isolation, has to be done by a group of committed partners. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Betty Ann. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was exceptional. That's a great example. And Bettina, those examples are really excellent. In the interest of time, I'm going to turn to David Freshwater, and he has the job. When I thought about who could land the plane on this discussion, and bring together how rural policies, urban policies, maybe regional policies could support the connections that you're hearing. I really just thought of David Freshwater. He's a former agricultural economist at the University of Kentucky, but he's so much more than that. And he's also has worked with the rural team here in different categories, in different capacities over the years. So David, the floor is yours. And I think you have one slide, so that worked out really well for you in this discussion.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Betty Ann. And Betty Ann neglected to tell you that she told me that I'm going to be doing this 5 minutes before the meeting started. So here we go. I'll see whether I crash the plane on landing or whether it lands successfully. I'm going to start with what I heard before I talk about my three thoughts. And I'll kind of start with David's discussion. And I was super encouraged. This urban-rural linkage thing goes back to 2009 when I was the head of the rural unit, and the Czech government asked whether we could do something on rural-urban linkages, and that actually turned out to take 3 to 4 years to put in place. But that was that first report. And it's really important to understand that a huge share of farming takes place in close proximity to urban places. And that came out clearly in David's presentation, that if you look at functional regions, which are defined by commuting zones, they stretch, and for large metro, that stretches out a long way and covers a huge amount of land, a lot of which is in farmland. And exploiting those urban-rural linkages is a real opportunity for better environmental and economic development, both in cities and outside cities. And it's nice that the OECD is recognizing that as a real opportunity. I think Jesus' discussion was useful because it made clear that the focus of conventional agricultural policy still remains on more remote rural regions and large-scale farms. Big farms are the beneficiaries of conventional agricultural policy because they have either most of the land or most of the output. So they're the policy target. But farming's a lot more than that. And I think if we think about farming systems, that supply chain that Jesus put in place, I think we can see that there's a lot of ways that we can intervene to try and change how agriculture is structured, to try and make agriculture better connected to the interests of consumers. But it requires more understanding. And everybody made that point. I think I'm probably part of the last generation of people who grew up with a direct connection to agriculture. When I was in high school, most of the kids I was in high school with were from farms. My grandparents were farmers. My kids have no connection to agriculture. Most people have no direct connection to agriculture, and it's easy to misunderstand what agriculture is. We hear a lot about corporate agriculture. Well, yeah, they're corporations, but those corporations are family corporations. They're family farms for the most part. And those family farms produce the vast majority of agriculture production. We don't know who the farmers are. I have a friend who family operates a large, well, not even a large farm, a pretty good sized farm in Indiana, about 1,000 hectares, and they have no equipment because they realized that it was better for them to contract with their neighbors who have lots of equipment, and they make all the decisions. But they don't sit on a tractor anymore. So are they the farmers? Well, if the farmer is the person who makes the decision about farming, about what's going to be produced and how it's going to be produced, then yes, they're farmers. If they're the person farmer is the person who sits on the tractor, well, then they're not farmers. So it's very unclear as to who farmers are anymore. And that complicates this discussion. Nick's presentation on the Netherlands I found incredibly fascinating because it really is a piece of where agriculture is going. It's a good, the Netherlands has managed to be both a highly successful urban state, but also a major agricultural exporter. But the contradictions in that are clear, the environmental consequences and how you go about managing things like potential diseases and integrating all the different forms of urban agriculture, including glass houses and vertical farms, into a production system that is still very much oriented towards producing commodities that trade at global prices is a fascinating question for people to resolve. And then the last two presentations I thought were really nice because what they did was show that if you push it down to a local level, there's alternatives to the conventional food supply chain. And it has to be done at the local level because that's how you connect consumers to producers in something other than the standard farmers market model, which doesn't scale well. And I think Bill's point that you have to get to scale on this, not huge scale, but you have to get to a scale where you can make it interesting to mid-sized farmers and to larger institutions that can be a big enough market, is truly, those two approaches just showed that it's very possible to do that. And I think they provide a way for us to conceptualize alternative pathways for agricultural production. Okay, so my three thoughts. I'm an economist and I'm interested in economic growth, and all the economic growth models talk about is labor and capital and innovation. And what that means is they strip out what used to be called land in classical economics, and land is raw materials and energy. And raw materials and energy are rural for the most part. Raw materials and energy are a smaller share of agricultural of gross national product over time, but you can't produce very much with just labor. You produce services with labor and capital and innovation, but you don't produce goods without material inputs, and you can't even produce services without energy. So I think the role of rural is clear in our economy. If you think about it a little harder, green energy is largely rural. Wind, large-scale solar, biomass, AI and cloud computing are both use vast amount of electricity, and they're trying desperately to become green, which means they're located in places where there's more green energy, which means in rural areas. And yes, rural industries, including agriculture and forestry, produce carbon, but they can also sequester carbon. So we have to think a little bit, more about those materials and energy inputs into how we're going to effectuate this green transition. Several of the other presentations talked about making more effective rural interaction, and it requires pretty clear that it requires joint governance that satisfies both the rural and the urban interests. And Nick's tractor slide is not an uncommon thing in Europe, and we have similar issues in North America. But I think I'm going to give you two examples that I'm familiar with where there is a good rural-urban interaction that's sustained over time. And US farm bills, I think, are probably the most interesting case of urban and rural coalitions that have held together for 50, 60 years. The Farm Bill nominally is about supporting rural areas through farming support for forestry and rural settlements in terms of housing, energy, infrastructure, economic development assistance. And that's the piece that gets the real attention for rural areas. But the biggest part of USDA's budget is the food and nutrition.
Mochila para el médico, ¿eh? Porque
Pardon?
mientras me toca a mí, ya dijo que tenías que estar tú en tu
Sorry, someone.
Okay. Yeah, so the food and nutrition bills, the food stamp programs, women's, infants, and children programs are a massive amount of investment in improving nutrition. Now, is it the best way to improve nutrition? Perhaps not, but it certainly makes a lot of people life's a lot better. And the reason the Farm Bill is generally broadly supported is because the urban interests, which dominate the House of Representatives, vote for the food stamp portion, the nutrition programs, and the rural interests vote for the core farming bills. But that puts that coalition is incredibly stable, but it requires that Farm Bill help both urban and rural areas. So there's an urban-rural linkage there. I live in Lexington, which is the second biggest metropolitan area in the state of Kentucky, about 500,000 people. The metropolitan area is the core county of Fayette County and a ring of about five more rural counties. The Fayette urban county government has very strict land use regulations. The city and the county merged about 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so there is a county government that is both the city and the rural areas. And when they merged, they did a very smart thing. The county council has 10 members, but one of those districts is a ring around the city of Lexington. So there is a rural voice on the county government. Now, the standard approach would have been to cut pie-shaped districts that would have basically diluted the rural interest in every member's district, so that it would have just been an urban-biased county government. But by having the council, the rural county person, then you've got an opportunity for people to go to that in rural areas and say, okay, so these policies don't make as much sense for us. Can we get some modification? And that tends to happen fairly easily. And this is another way where you've got a formal process of making a rural voice present in a political discussion. And then my last point, I guess, is a bit more esoteric. And I didn't think about this until a couple of days ago, as you can see. When the incoming president did his first interview, he said, "I won because of immigration and groceries." And I suspect that that's true. But what does that mean? Well, immigration is a major issue in most OECD countries at this point in time. The workforce is declining in numbers in all countries. There are skill shortages that are being met by immigrants, nurses, assisted living workers, farm workers, construction workers, and there's a shortage and people in skilled trades are aging rapidly. We need immigrants. And we need immigrants in rural areas because the vast majority of immigrants are staying in urban areas. But at the same time, we seem not to want immigrants. But if you have, a declining workforce, then you're going to need to you have to increase productivity and you have to find ways to provide new sources of labor. The groceries part, I think, is truly interesting in terms of these rural-urban linkages. Clearly, people in the United States did not like the price increases that happened in the last 3 years at the grocery store. And that reversed a long trend that I think we've become over-accustomed to, that the share of household income going to food has steadily declined. And at the same time, the share of household, the mix between expenditures on food purchased away from home and food produced, food made at home, has shifted. So there's more food away from home. And that's led to all sorts of interesting developments, including Uber Eats and Deliveroo, and all sorts of the rapid growth of fast food restaurants, which have health consequences. But all of this would have been a complete shock to Malthus, who said that we're going to have increasing shortages of food. So, but what the question is, as we start internalizing the externalities in the food system, that's going to have a large consequence for urban areas, because the urban population is the largest share of population, and those people and urban people require food to be largely delivered to them, even though we can produce some small share of urban food locally. A city the size of New York or London, where you have 8 million people, is never going to be self-sufficient in food. It can't be. There's just too many people, and the prospects of urban farming don't get there. So what if we lose key herbicides like Roundup, and that basically would require a major shift of people going back into agriculture and higher priced food, which would change how people live, and it would cause perhaps food shortages that Malthus predicted, and it would lead to a very different urban system, I would think. But I don't know that that's going to happen. I hope it doesn't happen. And as a result, I think we need to spend more time on thinking about the future of agriculture and how we incorporate prices into the cost of food into society, so that we have a transition that is green and fair, but also doesn't lead to increased food costs. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for you did very well that I asked you in the last minute. I think that was a very good wrap up to this discussion. And I appreciate everyone. I know we went over and asked a bit of your time, but the majority of you stayed with us, so that's my thanks. I am happy to take one or two questions before we close. If anyone wants to put their hand up, or if there's a question that you have, now is the moment. I don't want to get an email saying you didn't give me a chance to ask a question. So now is that moment. I know the chat has been busy. I don't see any hands going up. So what I will say is this is the beginning of a discussion, not the end. As I said at the beginning, it's impossible to do rural-urban connections in one meeting. As you can see, I even just tried to compartmentalize it and take agriculture out, and that I lost time even doing that. So we will continue to explore this in the new year with more segments. So I invite you to join us. We've recorded the session. The presentations will be shared. I had some key messages and thoughts that I took away from this. One is just the need to really invest more in understanding these different dimensions. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. I thought I saw a hand. I might have gone away, but if there are no questions, thank you so much for your time, and look forward to continuing this discussion in future episodes. Oh, wait, Bettina, did you want to say something? Thank you so much. All
No,
right.
I just wanted to clap. Thank you, everybody. It was been great to be here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.